Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the Making 2048 series. In the previous episode, which you should see if you haven't yet, we started coding the main parts of the game. And in this episode, we're going to continue where we left off. So if we go to our game, right now, we did a good job of setting everything up. So we have all our methods down, our main loop for the game is done, and so right now the only thing that we really need to do is fill in our methods. Now, I guess we should start at the top because printing our grid is pretty important, and it's something that we can get over it real quickly since it's not as complicated as shifting up and shifting right and shifting left and shifting down. So if we go to our print grid, we need to realize that our grid right now is a 2D array. So whenever we want to print something from an array, it's always important to use a for loop. And the reason is because we're trying to go through everything in our array and print it out. So to do something, to loop through the grid, we want to have a for loop. Now, let's create a for loop that goes through every element in the grid. So for I in, and then in our parameters, the one problem is that we want to go through every element inside the inner arrays as well, because we have a 2D array, so we need to go through every outer array and then everything inside that array. So for the first for loop, let's go through everything in the outer array. So we know that we have 4 outer arrays, so we can simply type for I in range 4, and we use 4 because remember that the index is goes from 0 to 3, and so if we have a 4, this for loop excludes the 4, so it'll go from 0 to 3. Okay, so now inside this for loop, we need to have another for loop that goes through every number inside the inner array. So we need to have a for loop inside this for loop. So let's type in for I in range, it should not be I, it should be a different variable. So let's say j in range 4, and we use 4 because inside each array there are 4 numbers, and as we talked about, the indexes go from 0 to 3, and since this for loop excludes the 4, it'll also go from 0 to 3. And then we want to print the number out. So we can simply type print grid I of j. So again, this is getting the number inside the grid that has a row I and column j. Now, the only issue is that if we want to print this out into like a 4x4 grid, the only issue is that we need to have something that separates each number. Like, there needs to be some space in between each number in a column, or else it just won't look as good. So the way we can do this is by putting a comma, and then we can type end equals, and then in quotation marks, let's put like 3 spaces. So now everything in a row, all the numbers will have some space in between them. So if we, let's see, I'm going to comment out these methods for now so that I can, so we can see how it prints out to see if it works. And I'll comment this out as well. So now if we run this, sorry. I'll comment this out as well. And you can follow along since we're just trying to see if the print grid will work. So yeah, so you'll see that every number printed out, which is good, and there's a space in between every number because we put this end equals with space in between. But you'll see that there is no actual grid. They're all printed out on the same row. And we want it so that each row has only 4 numbers, and there should be 4 rows. Right now, there's only 1 row with all 16 of the numbers. So if we go back to our print grid method, you'll kind of see that this makes sense because after we go through everything in a column, we don't do anything to make sure that there's a new line, right? So after the column is finished printing and it moves on to the next row, there's nothing, it'll just keep on printing on that same row. Now there's a simple fix that we can do this, that we can fix this by, and that's by simply putting an empty print statement at the end of the inner for loop. At the end of the outer for loop. And the reason that we do this is because once the row is finished printing everything, it'll start a new line so that when we start printing out the second row, it'll print out on a separate line. So I guess to show this in action, if we run this, you'll see that it's exactly how we want it, right? There are 4 numbers in each row, and there are 4 rows and 4 columns, obviously. Now, this code looks pretty simple, but it's kind of hard to kind of see what's happening exactly. So I pulled up a drawing to kind of help show you. So right now we have our grid was a 4x4 array. So you'll see right here, this is a 4x4 array, and it has 4 columns and 4 rows. Now with our for loops, what we needed to do was first go through every row, right? Because obviously we're trying to print out every single number inside this 2D array into a grid. So in our outer for loop, in our first for loop, we had to go through every row. So we started from row 1, then we went to row 2, then we went to row 3, then we went to row 4. Now, just this for loop would work if we had a single array. Let's say if we had an array of 4 elements, this would work. But we have a 2D array. And so what that means is that we have columns as well. And that's important because inside each row, we don't just print 1 element, we print out 4. And so once so instead of going from row 1 to row 2, immediately, what happens is that we start at row 1, then we go through all the columns. So we start at row 1, then we go through column 1, column 2, column 3, and then column 4. Then, once this is done, we go down to the next row, and then we print out column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, then we go to row 3, and so on. And so the reason we need 2 for loops is that we need one to go through all the rows. So we need one that goes from row 1, then to row 2, to row 3, to row 4. Now the inner array basically puts a step in between going from row 1 to row 2. And that step is simply going through every number in the row. So basically going through each column so that we can print out every single number. So yeah, that's the best way of putting it. So we start out here, go through, then start here, go through, and so on. So yeah, so that is our print grid. And as you saw, as we ran it, I'll run it again, you'll see that it works. And it prints out as much as we want. And then if you want, you can add more spaces in between each column. So if you want more spaces at the end, you'll see that it prints farther apart. So yeah, but for now, let's keep it at 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, for now, let's keep it at 4 spaces in between. Okay, so that was good. We have one method out of this 5 that we need. So now let us go to our generate method. Now this is also one of the simpler ones, since all we're doing is essentially putting a number in the grid. Now, yeah, so we basically need the generate function or method because if you know, if you've played the game before, you'll know that after you make a move, a new number pops up at random. So that's why we need this generate method. And so for this generate method, since the number that we generate is random and the place that we put it is random, we're going to have to generate a random number. Now, if you remember from episode 1, you'll remember that at the beginning, or whenever we want to have a random generator, I guess, at the top we have to type from random import rand range. And again, we didn't really go into much detail about why we need this exactly, but basically it'll allow us to use this rand range function, which will help us generate a number. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, if we go to our generate method, we first need to generate a random number that is either 2 or 4. Now, let's just say that there is a 75% chance that we can generate a 2. Because in the game, I think 2s generate more often than 4s, I think. But yeah, for our game, we'll say that there's a 75% chance that we generate a 2. And so, in order to incorporate this, we'll need to first generate a random number from 0 to 3. And the reason that we do this is because that'll give us 4 numbers, so then we can say if the number is 0, 1, or 2, then our number that we generate should be a 2. And if the number that we generate is a 3, then our number that we place in the grid should be a 4. So basically, when I type out this is not actually generating the number that we want to put in our grid, but it's just a number to help us calculate the odds of getting a 2 or a 4 inside the grid. So yeah, so this will generate a random number from 0 to 3. And let's say, let's save this in a number called odds, or yeah, odds, because we're just generating the odd of it being a 2 or a 4. Okay, so as we said, if this number is greater or equal to 0, and it's less than 3, or less than or equal to 2, either way works, then we should generate a random number. Let's call it random number, and it'll be 2. Else, so if the random number that we generated for odds is 3, then we want to set it to be 4. So yeah, basically this is just giving us a way to implement having a 75% chance that the random number that we generate is 2. So yeah. Okay, so now that we have the number that we want to put in the grid, we have to figure out to where in the grid we want to keep it. Now, yeah, so the way we can do this is by figuring out where to place it. And the easiest way of doing this is by generating a random row and a random column. So let's do that right now. So rand row is equal to rand range. And then again, we put 4 because we want to generate a random number from 0 to 3, since those are the indexes of our array. And then for the rand call, we'll do the same thing. So generating a random number from 0 to 3. Okay. Now, the only issue with this is that we don't know if the random row and column that we generated already is filled. So let's say, for example, we generate a 0 for rand row and a 1 for random column. However, we don't know if a number is already at row 0 and column 1. And so we simply need to do an if statement to check. So let's do if grid. So we're basically checking if there's a number with this row and this column already in our grid. And we'll say greater than 0, because if it's greater than 0, that just basically means that it's filled, right? Since zeros represent that it's not filled, and if it is filled, then it'll be greater than 0, because it'll be 2, 4, or 8, or so on. And so if that's the case, we simply need to do this again. And so, yeah, this makes sense, but if you kind of sense that there's something wrong, it's because we don't know if this number that we generated, again, also is filled, right? So here, we generated a random row and a random column, and we checked if that row and column is already filled. And so we generated a new random row and a random column, but we don't know if this new random row and random column that we generated is also filled in our grid, right? So since we're choosing this at random, we don't know whether it's filled or not. And the issue is that we can't keep on putting if statements to check, since we never know when this will generate a number, or we never know when this will generate a row and column that's not already filled. So we can simply change this to a while statement. And again, I guess if we go back to our drawing for a second. So let's say we generated a 2 and a 0. So we'll look here in our grid. However, it could already be filled, right? And so if we have an if statement check, if it's already filled, and let's say we generate another random row and a random column, and we get 1 and 1. Now our grid might be filled here again, and so if we have another if statement, we can generate a random row and a random column, so let's say 3 and 2. But again, there's no guarantee that it's empty. And so we use a while loop, because this will basically keep on generating a random row and a random column until that random row and column is not filled. So yeah, so that's kind of the best way of putting it. Essentially, we're just trying to find an empty cell randomly, and then and then we'll have to put our number inside there. Okay, so yeah, so now that we have a random row and a random column, and we also have a random number, we just need to put our rand number inside the grid with, or at the random row and the random column. Like that. And so let's just get rid of these comments because our generate method works. If we run this and let's say and then yeah, if we type in let's see. Oh, sorry. I actually got this mixed up. But since we're putting the random number inside the grid, we put it like this. Yeah, it's always important to remember that whenever you have a equal sign, we take what's on the right and put it into whatever is on the left. So we want to put the random number inside the grid. We don't want to set our random number to be the number in the grid. So if we run this, and then fix the indentation, and if we run it, yeah, it should work. So you'll see that 2 numbers generate, and then obviously right now our shifting doesn't work, but if I just put random numbers in, you'll see that a new number generates each time, and it generates in a random place. So that's good, right? And also, and make sure that it doesn't generate at a cell that's already filled. So every time we enter a letter, you'll see that a number always generates. So that's good. And if we close this, okay, so yeah, so for this, that'll be this for this episode. We went over the print grid and the generate. And our game is actually coming along very nicely. We have our grid that we can print out. We're generating numbers. And we have a while loop so that our game functions. Now, the only thing that we need to finish is our shifting. And we'll go over that in our next episode. So yeah, so thank you all for watching. If you have any comments, make sure to leave it in the comment section below. And yeah, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.